Everybody knew something was off. Nobody could prove it.
The sandwich looked the same, the price looked the same, the name said footlong. Then one teenager put a tape measure next to his lunch and got 11 inches. He wasn't the last person to start measuring. Part 1. The number that didn't add up. January 2013, Australia. A teenager named Matt Corby buys a footlong sub. The same sandwich millions of people buy every day without thinking about it once.
Something feels short. Not dramatically, just short.
Most people stop there. You shrug, you eat it, you forget. That feeling never survives contact with lunch. Matt didn't shrug. He put a tape measure next to it. 11 inches, not 12, 11. On a product whose entire name, the name on the menu board, the name people used when ordering, was a unit of measurement.
He photographed it and posted it on Subway's own Facebook page with 4 words underneath. Subway, please respond.
Now here's the part most people forget. That photo on its own proves almost nothing. One sandwich, one store, one oven. Bread is a living thing. It rises, it shrinks, it varies. Anybody who has baked knows a single short loaf isn't a scandal. It's a Tuesday. If it had stayed one photo, this dies in a comment section by Friday. It didn't stay one photo. What happened over the next 72 hours turned one short sandwich into a decade-long problem that reached 3 court systems on 2 continents, including one ruling Subway never saw coming, brought not by a customer, not by a journalist, but by someone inside the company's own network. We'll get to that. First, what happened when other people picked up rulers?
Part 2. The pattern that ruled out coincidence.
Within days, the photo had over 100,000 reactions, and people started doing the thing nobody had bothered to do. Checking. Customers across multiple countries posted their own photos. Same tape measure, same number, 11, sometimes 11 and a half. Then the New York Post tested it properly. Reporters bought footlongs at random Subway locations across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. Not one store, not one borough. 7 sandwiches. 4 came in under 12 inches, between 11 and 11 and a half. That's the number that changed the conversation, not the 11, the 4 out of 7. Because one short sandwich is variance. 4 out of 7 is a distribution, and a distribution has a cause. Then a New Jersey attorney preparing litigation measured sandwiches across 17 locations. His claim afterward was that not one measured exactly 12 inches.
Different stores, different states, different countries, different ovens, different staff, different days.
And the shortfall kept landing in the same narrow band. An inch, half an inch. Never 12. That's not how random error behaves. Random error scatters. It gives you some 11s and some 13s. Nobody was posting 13-inch sandwiches. There was no flood of photos showing bread hanging off the end of the paper. The gap only ever went one direction. And a gap that only goes one direction isn't chance. It's a system producing an output that doesn't match the label on the outside of it. Subway answered that twice. And the 2 answers didn't match each other.
Part 3. 2 answers that couldn't both be true.
When Matt Corby posted his photo, Subway Australia replied directly in the comments. The reply was polite. It thanked him, and it said the bread in his photo had not been baked to the company's standards. Read that carefully because it makes a specific admission. 12 inches is the standard, and this sandwich failed it. That's a quality control answer. The target is real, and this one missed. Then the story went global, the lawsuits started arriving, and a different answer appeared in the press. The one people still bring up 13 years later. That footlong functioned as a registered trademark and a descriptive name for the product, rather than a literal measurement of the sandwich. Sit with those side by side. Answer 1. The bread should have been 12 inches and this one wasn't. Answer 2. The name was never a promise about length. Both cannot be true at the same time. If the name isn't a measurement, there's no standard to fail. If there's a standard to fail, the name is a measurement. And that contradiction is why this exploded. It wasn't the inch. Nobody's life was damaged by an inch of bread. It was watching a company answer the same question two different ways depending on who was asking, a customer or a lawyer.
Then, under pressure, Subway told the Chicago Tribune its commitment was for every footlong to be 12 inches at every location worldwide, which is answer one again.
This failed our standard. The name isn't a standard. Our commitment is to the standard. Customers drew the obvious conclusion that they'd been quietly shorted for years and were watching it get managed in real time. Except here's where this gets interesting and where almost every video about this story gets it wrong. When lawyers finally got into Subway's production data under discovery, they found something that reframed the entire scandal, and it was not what the people holding tape measures expected. Part 4. The objection that should have ended it. Here's the defense, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved away, because a story is only worth telling if you test it against the strongest version of the other side. Subway does not bake bread from scratch. It never has. Every location receives frozen dough sticks made at outside facilities, then thawed, stretched into a pan, proofed, and baked on site. And the critical detail is this. Those dough sticks are portioned by weight, not by length. Under discovery in the consolidated litigation, Subway demonstrated it used standard, equally weighted dough sticks, same mass of dough every time, every store. Discovery also indicated the overwhelming majority of sandwiches did measure 12 inches. Think about what that means physically. If every sandwich starts from an identical weight of dough, one that bakes out to 11 inches doesn't contain less food than one that bakes out to 12. It contains the same food distributed differently. A fraction denser, a fraction shorter, because dough behaves differently depending on how long it proofed, how humid the store was, how it was stretched that shift. You didn't lose an inch of ham. You lost an inch of geometry. This is why the court record eventually described uniformity in bread length as effectively impossible given natural variation in baking. Not as an excuse, as physics. So on the narrow question that started everything, were customers getting less food? The honest answer, supported by the record, is no. Not measurably, which should have been the end of it. It wasn't, because when the settlement reached a federal appeals court, the court did not say nothing happened here. It said something considerably harsher. And it said it about the people who were supposed to be fixing the problem. Part 5, the gap nobody built an alarm for. Before the courtroom, we need the structure underneath this because it explains everything that follows. The bread, the tuna, the chicken, all of it. Most people picture a fast food chain as one company that owns its restaurants and runs them like a production line. That is not what Subway is and never was. It grew into one of the largest restaurant networks on earth almost entirely through franchising. The overwhelming majority of locations are owned and run by independent franchisees. So the brand controls three things tightly: the ingredients shipped in, the recipes, and the marketing. What it doesn't control, minute to minute, is thousands of independent kitchens, and the dough is made somewhere else. The proteins are processed, cooked, mixed, and packed somewhere else. They arrive frozen or sealed, already finished, at a store whose job is assembly, not production. So when you stand at that glass counter watching your sandwich get built, which is the single most famous thing about this chain, the entire brand promise, you can see everything. What you're actually watching is the last 5% of the process. Everything that could go wrong went wrong before the food reached the glass. The dough's weight and formulation, upstream. The composition of the tuna in that steel pan, upstream. What's in the chicken strip, upstream. The sugar content of the bread, upstream. The employee in front of you cannot verify any of it. They receive sealed inputs and assemble them. No scale on the counter. No lab in the back. The store, like the customer, is trusting a label from a facility it has never seen. That's the gap. And it isn't a Subway invention. It's how nearly all fast food works. Subway just happens to be the chain that built its identity on the promise you could watch your food being made, which makes the distance between what you're allowed to see and what actually determines your meal unusually stark. Hold on to that. It explains the second half of this story. Part 6. The settlement that paid everyone except the customers. The lawsuits were consolidated into one federal case in the Eastern District of Wisconsin. The plaintiffs had a structural problem, and it was almost comic. To prove damages, you need evidence. The evidence had been eaten. Every allegedly short sandwich in America was gone, digested, unrecoverable. One of the lead attorneys effectively conceded damages were extraordinarily hard to establish for exactly that reason. So the damages claims were dropped and the case pivoted to injunctive relief. No money for customers, but Subway agrees to change how it operates. In 2016, a settlement was approved. Subway committed to quality control measures for 4 years, including requiring franchisees to keep a measuring tool in stores to check loaves hit 12 inches. The 10 named plaintiffs each received $500. The plaintiffs' attorneys were awarded $520,000 in fees. Everyone else in the class, meaning essentially every Subway customer in America, got nothing. And one class member refused to accept it. Ted Frank of the Center for Class Action Fairness objected on the grounds that the settlement delivered no meaningful benefit to the people it claimed to represent and appealed. On August 25, 2017, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with him. And the language it used is why this case still gets taught. Writing for a unanimous panel, Judge Diane Sykes described the relief as utterly worthless. The court noted the settlement itself acknowledged that perfectly uniform bread length remained impossible due to variation in baking, meaning the agreement conceded in its own text that it could not deliver the thing it existed to deliver. When the parties argued, class members at least gained the ability to seek contempt sanctions if Subway breached it. The court dismantled that in one line. Contempt used to enforce a worthless settlement is itself worthless. 0 plus 0 equals 0. The panel invoked the standard that a class action producing only fees for lawyers and no real benefit for the class is, in Judge Richard Posner's phrasing, no better than a racket, and found that apt here. The settlement was vacated, the case was remanded with instructions to dismiss, so 4 years of litigation landed here. A court concluded the claims had little merit, and the same court concluded the remedy was worth nothing to consumers and existed mainly to generate legal fees. Both sides lost. The customer, who was the entire justification for the exercise, walked away with a measuring tool bolted to a countertop and not a cent. And within a few years, people stopped asking how long the sandwich was and started asking what was inside it. If this is landing for you, a like genuinely helps push it further. Takes 1 second. Part 7. The question moves inside the bread. January 2021. 2 California residents, Karen Denoa and Neelima Amin, filed a proposed class action in federal court in the Northern District of California. Their allegation wasn't about size, it was that Subway's tuna was not tuna, that the product lacked the ingredient it was named after. That's a different accusation entirely. Length is a rounding error, identity is not. A few months later, the New York Times ran an investigation. A reporter purchased 60 inches of tuna sandwiches from 3 Los Angeles area locations and sent the samples to a commercial lab for DNA analysis. The result was that no amplifiable tuna DNA was found. The lab could not identify any of the 5 tuna species it tested for. That headline went around the world in hours, and it's where most retellings of this story stop, because stopping there is more satisfying than continuing. But the caveat is buried in the same reporting, and it isn't small. The Times noted directly that when tuna is cooked, its DNA becomes denatured. The structure changes and results become unreliable. The lab had been wary going in about identifying a fish cooked at least once, mixed with mayonnaise, frozen, and shipped across the country. and it offered two possible readings of its own findings. Either the product was so heavily processed no identification was possible, or there was nothing there. Two explanations. The reporting did not choose between them. Then it got sharper. Applied Food Technologies, a DNA testing firm, stated that the retort process used in canned tuna production degrades and fragments DNA, and that identifying processed tuna requires specialized primers built for that problem. In other words, a negative result from a standard test on cooked tuna is close to meaningless because the test was never designed to survive cooking. Separately, Inside Edition commissioned its own testing and reported finding tuna. And the lawsuit did something telling. The original claim was that the product contained no tuna. That was amended, then amended again. At one point shifting to sustainability, at another alleging other animal proteins, and finally arguing the product wasn't 100% tuna rather than that it contained none. A claim that changed shape every time it was pushed on. In 2023, the lead plaintiff moved to dismiss, citing a difficult pregnancy. The case was dismissed with prejudice, permanently. Subway then sought over $617,000 in sanctions against the plaintiff's attorneys, arguing the suit had been meritless from the start. At the hearing, one of the plaintiff's own lawyers told the court he was embarrassed about some of the lawyering in the case, Subway's position throughout and after. It serves 100% real, wild-caught tuna, and the claims were meritless and damaging to franchisees. Let's be precise about what that establishes, because precision is the only thing separating this from a rumor. Established. A lab commissioned by a major newspaper could not detect tuna DNA in process samples. Documented. Also established. That kind of testing on cooked tuna is widely regarded as unreliable. The lab flagged the limitation itself. Competing tests found tuna. The central claim was repeatedly amended, and the case was dismissed with no finding against Subway. Not established. That Subway sold a product without tuna in it. No court found that. No regulator found that. Anyone telling you otherwise is telling you something the record doesn't support. So the tuna question ended unresolved rather than proven. But notice that a nearly identical fight had already happened 4 years earlier on another continent about a different protein. Part 8. The Same Fight, Different Meat. 2017. The CBC's investigative program Marketplace commissioned DNA testing at Trent University on chicken products from several fast food chains. The reported finding for Subway was that roughly half the DNA in its chicken was chicken, with soy accounting for much of the rest. Competing chains tested closer to pure chicken. Subway rejected it outright. Its own testing, it said, found no more than 1% soy, and the methodology was seriously flawed. It then filed a defamation lawsuit seeking 210 million Canadian dollars against the CBC and others, arguing the testing lacked scientific rigor. In 2019, an Ontario judge dismissed that suit under anti-SLAPP legislation, ruling the report addressed a matter of genuine public interest, writing that few things matter more acutely to the public than what they eat. In January 2021, the Ontario Court of Appeal set the dismissal aside, finding Subway's claim was far from frivolous and deserved to be tested on its merits. The Supreme Court of Canada later declined to hear the CBC's bid to stop it. So the case was allowed to proceed, which means the underlying dispute, how much chicken is in the chicken, has never been settled by a court either. Two sets of tests, two sets of experts, opposite conclusions, two proteins, two DNA disputes, two unresolved fights. Which brings us to the one thing in this entire story that a court did resolve definitively in a written judgment. And it wasn't about the meat at all. Part 9. The ruling that came from inside the House. September 29th, 2020. Ireland's Supreme Court. The case wasn't brought by an angry customer, not by a journalist or a class action firm. It was brought by Bookfinders Limited, a Subway franchisee. The franchisee wasn't attacking the brand, it was trying to save money. Under Ireland's Value-Added Tax Act of 1972, staple foods, bread among them, can be taxed at 0%. The franchisee argued its products qualified. To decide that, the court had to answer a question nobody expected to be litigated. Is Subway's bread legally bread? Irish law contains an actual statutory definition. For a product to count as bread, ingredients including fat, sugar, and bread improver must not exceed 2% of the weight of the flour in the dough. The statute exists to separate bread as a staple food from baked goods that are or approach confectionery. The judgment recorded that there was no dispute Subway's bread had a sugar content of 10% of the weight of the flour, 5 times the statutory limit. 5 judges, a 51-page decision. The conclusion was that the product fell outside the legal definition of bread for the purposes of the Act and was properly classed as confectionery, taxable at 13.5% rather than 0. Now, the necessary precision, because this one gets exaggerated constantly. This ruling was about tax classification, not food safety, not nutrition labeling, not fraud. It does not mean the bread was dangerous or mislabeled to customers, and it does not mean it isn't bread in the everyday sense. Subway said exactly that in response. That its bread is of course bread and that it had been baking it in its restaurants for over 3 decades. Plenty of commercial breads worldwide would fail that same threshold. Ireland's definition is unusually strict, but strip the tax context away and look at what remains, because this is the part that matters. Every previous fight in this story was a fight about measurement. How long is the bread? Is that tuna? Is that chicken? Everyone collapsed into dueling experts and unresolved records. This one didn't, for one reason. The number was never in dispute. 10%. Subway's own formulation. Nobody had to test anything. Nobody had to argue about denatured DNA or baking variation. The recipe said what it said, the statute said what it said, and the gap was arithmetic. The most damaging finding about Subway's food in over a decade wasn't uncovered by a customer with a tape measure, a newspaper lab, or an investigative broadcaster. It surfaced because one franchisee asked a tax question, and the answer required somebody to finally read the recipe out loud. Part 10. What this pattern actually is. Step back. Between 2013 and 2023, 4 separate controversies about one company's food on 3 continents involving 4 different products. And here's what's striking. In almost every case, the specific accusation failed. The sandwiches weren't shorting people on food. The tuna case was dismissed with prejudice. The chicken dispute remains unresolved. Only the Irish ruling produced a definitive finding, and it was about a statute, not a scandal. By the standard of proven wrongdoing, Subway largely came out the other side. So why does none of that feel reassuring? Because in every case, the same condition produced the fight, and no outcome ever addressed it. Each time, a customer was making a decision based on a short, confident word: footlong, tuna, chicken, bread. While the reality behind that word was a specification decided in a facility they'd never see, governed by tolerances they'd never be told, verified by nobody they could ask. Foot long meant a fixed dough weight, not a fixed length. Tuna meant a processed product whose composition can't be verified by any test a normal person could commission. Bread meant a formulation that in at least one country's law sits closer to confectionery. Nobody told the customer any of that, and none of it is a lie. Every one is a gap between the one-word promise on the menu and the technical truth behind it. And each time the gap got exposed, the company's answer was, in effect, technically we were correct. The frustrating thing is that they usually were. And that's more unsettling than fraud would be. Fraud has a villain, a mechanism, a remedy. This has none of those. It's a structure that lets a company be completely accurate and completely misleading at once, with no rule broken anywhere in the chain. Part 11. What a refund doesn't fix. Here's what a settlement or a dismissal never touches. You walk into a sandwich shop with a normal day behind you and a normal day ahead. You're not carrying a ruler, you're not carrying a DNA sequencer, you're not reading a 51-page Supreme Court judgment before ordering lunch. You read a word on a board and you trust it, not because you're careless, because the transaction only functions if you do. That trust isn't a personal choice. It's the load-bearing wall of the whole industry. It's not the inch. It was never worth the inch. It's the next time you're standing at that counter watching your sandwich get assembled, through the glass in full view, exactly the way the brand promised. And for the first time, you notice that everything you're allowed to see is the part that was never in question. That small, quiet hesitation is a different category of damage. It doesn't resolve when a case gets dismissed. It doesn't expire when the news cycle. Everybody knew something was off. Nobody could prove it. The sandwich looked the same, the price looked the same, the name said footlong. Then one teenager put a tape measure next to his lunch and got 11 inches. He wasn't the last person to start measuring. Part 1. The number that didn't add up. January 2013, Australia. A teenager named Matt Corby buys a footlong sub. The same sandwich millions of people buy every day without thinking about it once. Something feels short, not dramatically, just short. Most people stop there. You shrug, you eat it, you forget. That feeling never survives contact with lunch. Matt didn't shrug. He put a tape measure next to it. 11 inches, not 12, 11. On a product whose entire name, the name on the menu board, the name people used when ordering, was a unit of measurement. He photographed it and posted it on Subway's own Facebook page with 4 words underneath. Subway, please respond. Now here's the part most people forget. That photo on its own proves almost nothing. One sandwich, one store, one oven. Bread is a living thing. It rises, it shrinks, it varies. Anybody who has baked knows a single short loaf isn't a scandal. It's a Tuesday. If it had stayed one photo, this dies in a comment section by Friday. It didn't stay one photo. What happened over the next 72 hours turned one short sandwich into a decade-long problem that reached 3 court systems on 2 continents, including one ruling Subway never saw coming, brought not by a customer, not by a journalist, but by someone inside the company's own network. We'll get to that. First, what happened when other people picked up rulers? Part 2. The pattern that ruled out coincidence. Within days, the photo had over 100,000 reactions, and people started doing the thing nobody had bothered to do. Checking. Customers across multiple countries posted their own photos. Same tape measure, same number, 11, sometimes 11 and a half. Then the New York Post tested it properly. Reporters bought footlongs at random Subway locations across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. Not one store, not one borough. 7 sandwiches. 4 came in under 12 inches, between 11 and 11 and a half. That's the number that changed the conversation, not the 11, the 4 out of 7. Because one short sandwich is variance. 4 out of 7 is a distribution. And a distribution has a cause. Then a New Jersey attorney preparing litigation measured sandwiches across 17 locations. His claim afterward was that not one measured exactly 12 inches. Different stores, different states, different countries, different ovens, different staff, different days, and the shortfall kept landing in the same narrow band. An inch, half an inch. Never 12. That's not how random error behaves. Random error scatters. It gives you some 11s and some 13s. Nobody was posting 13-inch sandwiches. There was no flood of photos showing bread hanging off the end of the paper. The gap only ever went one direction. And a gap that only goes one direction isn't chance. It's a system producing an output that doesn't match the label on the outside of it. Subway answered that twice. And the 2 answers didn't match each other. Part 3. 2 answers that couldn't both be true. When Matt